Thank you very much. And I too would like to thank the organizers for giving me the chance to come here and speak at this meeting again. What I'm going to tell you is a continuation of the research project that I described 2 years ago in Atlanta. So those of you that were there will recognize the first few slides before I get on into new territory. And I put Vida Glatt down as an author of the talk because the data I'm going to show is much hers as they are mine, and it's a close collaboration that started when she did her PhD with me. She was having so much fun, she stayed on as a postdoc, went away, did a second postdoc, and has now recently returned to the US in San Antonio, setting up her own lab. So that's why she's there. And if there ever was a tissue that was mechanoresponsive and should be a good place to start when looking at regenerative rehabilitation, it's bone. It's been known for well over 100 years that it's mechanoresponsive. There's a famous Wolff's Law incorporated in his book, The Law of Transformation of Bone, and basically says that you apply force to bone and it responds. So the question then is, well, maybe bone's the low-hanging fruit for developing something in the area of regenerative rehabilitation. Every time I say low-hanging fruit in the lab, we all get hit on the head, so it's not maybe the best way to describe it, but it's certainly fueled some of our work in this area. Now, when you think of bone, if you break a long bone, you normally expect it to heal in about 6 weeks. But that's not always the case. About 5 to 10% of fractures either take a long time to heal, they're delayed unions, or they don't heal at all. These are non-unions, and they're very difficult to manage clinically. Then the other type of clinical need we address in the area of bone healing is when a large segment of bone is lost, for instance, a blast injury on the battlefield or a major automobile accident will leave you with a big piece of missing bone that fails to regenerate. For those of you not in the field, this is a schematic of how bone healing progresses. The first thing you get is a hematoma forming between the broken ends of the bone, and there's also an inflammatory infiltrate that resolves, and the first new tissue that's formed is cartilage, which forms a so-called soft or cartilaginous callus that then undergoes a process called endochondral ossification to form new bone in the place of the cartilage. And you end up, as I said, in about 6 weeks or so with a healed fracture that then has to go on and remodel to restore the mechanics and the properties of the bone that was broken. And the question for us is, can we accelerate and improve the quality of the healed bone by mechanical manipulation? Now, the first attempt at this was a concept known as dynamization that's been around for a while. As you see, Di Bastiani was publishing on it back in the 1980s. And that school of thought suggested that the way to go was, after a fracture, immediately fix the bone with very high stiffness so nothing can move, and allow that to persist until you see bone forming, at which time you reduce the stiffness of the fixation so the bone can now bear load and mature and remodel much more quickly and much more effectively. And so the way this was supposed to work is that the stiff initial fixation would be gradually reduced to a flexible fixation, which would push the healing pathway in this direction through the process of dynamization. Now, this has given mixed results clinically, and it really hasn't caught on and is not widely used, probably because what we know from the biology of cartilage formation and chondrogenesis is that efficient formation of cartilage from progenitor cells requires motion. And if you fix stiffly, you're going to inhibit the formation of chondrocytes from its progenitor cells. So our thinking was perhaps dynamization this way is back to front, and what we should really be doing is starting off with flexible fixation to encourage chondrogenesis once you start to form bone, you need stiff fixation. The endochondral process, the replacement of cartilage with bone, won't happen if there's too much motion. And this, we suggest, is the way to do it, by this process of reverse dynamization. So with it as background, we started examining this in a rat model we have. This is the rat femur. You can put an external fixator on the exposed bone, take out 5 millimeters of bone, and it won't heal. You now have a segmental defect that you can use as your experimental model to test various processes, such as, in our case, reverse dynamization. This is what it looks like in real life. And to adjust the stiffness of the fixation, we worked with Romano Mattis in Davos in Switzerland, who was at that time at the Mayo Research Institute. He now has his own company that makes these things. And he was probably a Swiss watchmaker in an earlier life, because he's very good at making tiny fixators with high precision for small animals such as rats and mice. And working with him, we were able to produce an external fixator for the rat that had introduced variable degrees of axial stiffness based on how thick this rod was. And we characterized it, and we could arrange a stiffness from 114 Newton per millimeter up to 254, and we tried it in the rat. And to cut a long story short, it worked. So basically, if you fix those rat bones at low axial stiffness, you get bone formed, but it's ugly bone and it's mechanically weak. If you do it at an intermediate stiffness, you still form bone, but they have this strange cyst-like formations that are not able to bear much mechanical weight. And then if you have stiffness the whole way through, again, you form bone, but there's some residual cartilage. The endochondral process hasn't gone to completion, and there are irregularities in the cortices of the bone. When you use reverse dynamization, where you start out with this low axial stiffness, and after 7 days you stiffen it up to the high stiffness, you get very, very nice bone forming. These are the by the way, the bottom panels are safranine fast green, which would stain cartilage red. Up here is H&E. You get very nice cortices formed. The marrow elements are reforming. This is where the pin was for the fixator. It's not an irregularity. And the mechanical strength is back to normal. So we saw this as a first validation of the idea of reverse dynamization. So we're now looking at it in greater detail to optimize and see at what point should you change from the flexible fixation to the stiff fixation. So this is an experiment, again, in rats, where some rats had the low stiffness the whole time, and other rats had high stiffness fixation the entire time. These experiments typically go out for anywhere from 5 to 8 weeks. We reverse dynamized at 3 days, 7 days. When I say reverse dynamized, the stiffness was fixed from low to high at these times, 14 days and 21 days. And this is the fixator use here is rather different for a technical reason you can ask me about later if you want to know. And these are 1 millimeter defects now, which is why the stiffness is the absolute value of the axial stiffness is different from in the previous experiment. And this is a bit of a complicated slide, but I'll talk you through it. And this is what we've found. So left of the dashed line is experiment I just described. Right of it are historical data from the same lab using what we call forward dynamization, where it starts stiff and it goes flexible. So if the fixation, this is at 5 weeks. If the bones are fixed stiffly the entire time, you don't get good bridging of the cortices. This is microcomputed tomography. If you stay with toluidine blue, just to get a general idea of what's going on, you see a fracture line through the site of the original defect. If you now start, and if you go flexible the whole time, you get lots of stuff forming, lots of callus, lots of material that still has a fracture line through it and is mechanically weak. If you start flexible and then bring it into stiff fixation at these various times, you improve matters until about day 7, day 14. You're now getting very good cortication. There's bridging of the defects. There's not too much of this trabecular bone filling the marrow cavity, and it's much superior to what we'd see with forward dynamization, with traditional dynamization that starts off stiff. Here at 7 days, there's no comparison between this and this, and at 21 days between this and this. And if you look more closely at the 14 days dynamization, you'll see here, again, this is safranino fast green, very nice formation of new cortices, the marrow elements are reforming, and just some irregularities around the original defect site, whereas flexible alone and stiff alone at these various time points don't give you good bone, and there's actually residual cartilage. So we've done a large number of experiments of the type I've just described to you, from which we can draw the general conclusions that when we reverse dynamize, we get accelerated healing of these rat defects. We get advanced remodeling that can be seen in all sorts of different parameters that mean things to people that study fracture healing, and in particular the recovery of mechanical strength, because in humans ultimately you want to be able to remove any hardware, remove a cast, and move around without risk of fracture. So what we're trying to do now, having established a proof of principle in these rats, is figure out what's going on. And these are experiments very much in progress. I don't have a complete set of data, but we've started with just 2 conditions where there's high stiffness and low stiffness, and we've just gone out for 2 weeks looking at which genes are expressed in the defect by RNA-seq. We go out 14 days because the accumulated experience from doing these in hundreds of rats is that all the decisions the rat bone makes to heal or not heal are basically made in the first 2 to 3 weeks. And after that, the die is cast and it's either going to heal or it's not going to heal. So we thought we'd look at the stages of hematoma formation 3 days after surgery, 7 days when we're starting to see cartilage, and then at 14 days when that cartilage is turning into bone. And as I said, don't have a full set of data, but I'll show you what we're working on. So in day 3, there are about 100 transcripts upregulated in the low stiffness state compared to the high stiffness, and 21 are downregulated. Day 7, it's reversed. There's nearly 100 genes upregulated in the high stiffness group compared to the low stiffness, and only 27 in the low stiffness compared to the high stiffness. And at day 14, they're the same. So this fits very nicely with what I just said about the observation that most of the interesting biological decisions are being made very early on after fracture, during the time that you're going from a hematoma to forming cartilage, and by the time you start forming bone, it's all over. Now, sorting through the different genes that are expressed and up and down regulated is work in progress, as I said, but you can cluster them as cell adhesion molecules go up, the different cell differentiation signals, cell proliferation. What interests me in particular is the inflammatory response. So one of the big debates in bone healing is whether the inflammatory response soon after fracture is an advantage for subsequent healing or whether it slows down subsequent healing, and nobody knows the answer. And I'm hoping that these sorts of experiments maybe can make a contribution to that area as well, because under the conditions of flexible stiffness, where we're getting accelerated healing and accelerated cartilage formation, a whole bunch of inflammatory cytokines are getting inhibited. Our favorites are interleukin-1 beta. That we work a lot on this in the context of osteoarthritis, and tend to think interleukin-1 beta causes every known disease. So to see it downregulated here under conditions where bone healing is enhanced is very encouraging. Also, TNF family genes are downregulated. IL-17, a lot of the chemokines. So it could be that this flexible this loose axial stiffness, this low axial stiffness fixation, is just acting as an anti-inflammatory agent. Doesn't, obviously, we can't prove that, but it's consistent with this, and that by diminishing the inflammatory response, we're enhancing chondrogenesis and downstream events. And that figures because we've shown quite convincingly that when you do in vitro chondrogenesis, starting with a chondroprogenitor cell and then ending up with the chondrocyte, these inflammatory mediators are very potent inhibitors of the process. So in the case of interleukin-1, for instance, picogram amounts of IL-1 will completely block the differentiation of a mesenchymal stromal cell into a chondrocyte. So we may be beginning to probe a little bit at a possible mechanism by doing these sorts of experiments. Now, going from the rat, we obviously want to end up in human beings, and the question is, how can we do that? Well, there's two avenues. One is if we can understand the biology of what's going on at this early stage of healing in the context of different stiffness fixations, maybe we can get some clues as to how to trick the bone into thinking it's loosely fixed by pharmacologic means or molecular means. And use that. Until we have more information, we can't do anything with this. The other one is the orthopedic approach, where we, just like we had fixators for the rats that we could adjust, we'll do the same for humans. And our first attempt at this was moving into a sheep model. This is another collaborator, Slobodan Tepic, who's based in Zurich, and he designed these fixators that we could put on a sheep. Now we're into the tibia. This is a 1.5 centimeter defect, and you can adjust the stiffness by adjusting these screws that hold these crossbars. And we put them through all the mechanical testing that we thought was necessary, and basically came to the conclusion that you could stand an elephant on this and it wouldn't break. It was that robust. So this is the surgery at Mayo, where we put these fixators onto a sheep. And then after the surgery, we had very nice post-operative figure images with the defect here and everything in the right place. And then 4 days later, catastrophe. So the pin came out here, it bent here, this one bent, this one poked through, and we had to euthanize the sheep. And it turns out that the sheep can put amazing forces on a piece of metal that you just don't see in laboratory testing. And we went through about 5 or 6 sheep and decided it wasn't fair on the sheep, and it wasn't fair on the funding agency, and it wasn't fair on us. So we abandoned this. But the talk after mine, you're going to hear a much more ingenious way at doing some of these experiments using a variation of a sheep model where you can get interesting data. So in terms of how to bring it into people, if you look in the literature, it's this very interesting paper from Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem where they take patients with tibial fractures, and these are often the problematic fractures that go on to non-union. And early on after the fracture, well, they put on an external fixator which can be adjusted to allow the weight to go through the bone or through the broken piece, or it can go through the fixator so the defect site's protected. And they asked the patient to put as much weight on the defect, on the fracture site, that they can bear. And then after a certain period of time, I think it's 15 days, that stops, they tighten up the fixator, and now we're in the stiff region of the healing process. And if you believe the data, they speed up healing dramatically by changing by not using classical dynamization, where you have an initial rigidity followed by dynamization, to one where you have an initial movement followed by rigidity, which is their version of saying reverse dynamization. So we're encouraged that this might work in humans, and if we just figure out a way to get there and how to do it effectively, we'd be ahead of the game. So with that, I've been acknowledging collaborators as I go through, and these are the rest of the team, a mixture of engineers, biologists, and trauma surgeons, and thank our funding sources, the AO Foundation, the Department of Defence, and Queensland University in Australia. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evan.